past couple of weeks, we've been talking about the law when it surrounds boating with Tom Sinas from Sinas Dramas Law Firm. But what about personal watercraft? You know, those jet skis and all those things you see out there. Let's break that down, and we'll bring him in right now. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Todd, how are you?
I'm well. So when it comes to jet skis and personal watercraft, is there an age limit? Do you need a license like a motorcycle? I mean, who gets to ride these things?
Great question, because the law actually has a whole separate area of state statutes that deal with personal watercraft. Most people, as you pointed out, call those jet skis. And one area where the law diverges is in answer to your question, and that is who can operate one of these. There are different rules here than there are for boats. So let's start with adults. For people who were born on or before December 31, 1978. December 31, 1978. That's a different day than the boating rule. If you're born on or before that date, you can operate a personal watercraft without restrictions. But if you're born after that day and you're at least 16, you can actually only legally operate a personal watercraft if you have a boating safety certificate. So that brings in, of course, a whole group of adults who were born after that date, who are required to have a boating safety certificate in order to operate a personal watercraft. For kids, the rules depend upon their age. If they're less than 14, then they cannot operate a personal watercraft. Simple as that. If they're between the age of 14 and 15, then they might be able to. They too have to have a boating safety certificate, and they have to be operating that personal watercraft with their parent or guardian basically nearby. So different rules for different age groups and a different set of rules in general than what we see with boats.
Okay, so there are some similarities and some differences there, but let's talk about injury, something that you deal with on a daily basis. If this happens in a personal water vehicle or watercraft, is it similar to automobiles or motorcycles?
Well, in some senses it is, yes, because the person who's operating the personal watercraft has an obligation and a potential liability to other people that they injure. They have an obligation to operate that personal watercraft safely. And another area where we see similarities here to boats and cars is in the area of what we call owner liability. And we spoke about this earlier in the context of traditional boats. And that is the concept that if you are the owner of a personal watercraft and you permit someone else to drive it, if the person who drives your personal watercraft does so carelessly, then the owner, even though the owner may not be the driver, then the owner is liable. And in certain circumstances, like particularly within a family, the law presumes that if one of your family members is operating your personal watercraft, then they've done so with your consent. So that really comes down to a similar lesson that we talked about with boats, which is that if you own one of these, you want to make sure that they are properly insured because it could be your liability as the owner. And you want to make sure you're cognizant of who it is that's driving the personal watercraft. And in that regard, we actually have some specific rules in state statutes about how you operate a personal watercraft. They're a little different than boats, and we can talk about those as well.
Okay, let's dive into that. I want to make sure before I dive into that, I want to make sure I understood. So if I got a 14, 15-year-old kid who's my son or daughter, they don't even have to ask. If they take that watercraft out without even asking, the owner still liable.
Well, generally speaking, the law would presume that if your child is driving your personal watercraft, then you've given them permission. Now, in certain circumstances, you could try to overcome that presumption. We call that a presumption. But generally speaking, the answer is yes. The law would presume that your child is operating with your consent. And in your example, you used a 14 or 15-year-old. That's problematic because of what we just talked about the rules about when teenagers can drive these devices.
So we know who can operate these things, and we know what happens when there are injuries. What about safety? Are there specific safety rules for personal watercraft?
There are. I mean, there is, of course, the general rule that anyone operating one of these things has to do so safely. They can't operate them at a speed that endangers or is likely to endanger others. But there are some other specific rules that apply to personal watercraft, and I'll just click off a few of them. Everyone on the personal watercraft has to be wearing a Coast Guard approved flotation device. That's true too for anyone being towed behind the personal watercraft. The lanyard of the watercraft's engine cutoff, what some people would consider the key, has to be attached to the person, clothing, or the flotation device of the operator. course, because if you fall off, you want the device to stop. You can't operate a personal watercraft after sunset or before 8 a.m. You have to drive at a slow, no-wake speed if you're crossing within 150 feet behind another vessel. Similarly, you have to operate at a slow or no-wake speed if you're operating within 200 feet of a Great Lakes shoreline. Also, along the same vein, you have to operate at a slow, no-wake speed if you are in waters of less than 2 feet or less. And you cannot harass wildlife or disturb aquatic vegetation in a personal watercraft. There are some other rules, but those are some of the ones where there's specific standards for these particular devices.
And of course, you want to be up to date on all of those regulations and those rules. I'm assuming that the under the influence, the DWIs, very similar?
Very similar. It is illegal. Alcohol and drugs and personal watercrafts do not mix, and they can subject people to serious criminal penalties if, heaven forbid, someone is injured or killed.
Well, if that does happen, Tom, and they need a good lawyer, who can they call?
Well, if they need information about this area, we'll have some stuff on our website at www.sinusdramus.com. They can contact us by phone at 616-301-3333 or shoot us an email at info@sinusdramus.com.